morning. I hope you all had a chance to get coffee and pastries. My name is Lauren Herzer-Reese, and together with my colleagues in the Environmental Change and Security Program, it's my pleasure to welcome you here for today's event on women, peace, and security. It was generous support from the UN Foundation's Universal Access Program that made this truly remarkable panel come together. Each of these women has dedicated some part of her career to forging a better understanding of the role of women in peace and security, the important role that they play, what barriers exist to their participation, and what opportunities exist to overcome those barriers. However, looking at the RSVP list and looking around the room, it's very obvious that these are not the only experts in the room, so that I hope when we get to the Q&A portion, you all feel, I would urge you to participate and ask your questions and give your comments. Before we get to the presentations, though, a quick word about where you're sitting. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. Together, we work here to bring together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and others working to address today's toughest challenges, to exchange ideas, to provide in-depth analysis, and to look across sectors for ways forward. The Environmental Change and Security Program has been doing this specifically at the intersection of environment, health, population, security for more than 20 years. And in that time, we've built a fairly incredible network of thinkers and doers across these sectors, 5 of whom are up here today. So I don't want to go too far into the weeds on that. I just want to welcome you all to the discussion, and I will introduce our moderator, Liz Leahy-Matson. Liz is the Program Director of International Programs at the Population Reference Bureau, where she leads the Empowering Evidence-Driven Advocacy Project. She has over 15 years specializing in family planning policy, political demography, modeling, and the intersections between population and multi-sectoral development. But perhaps most important, Liz is the author of 2 of the most read top 11 blogs on New Security blog, our online platform. So it's been online for 11 years, and Liz wrote not only 2 of the most popular 11 posts, but the most read post. So I think you should add that to your bio. Okay, so without further ado, thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, and the Wilson Center team for convening this event, and thank you all for joining us. We are looking forward to a very interesting discussion this morning with, appropriately enough, an all-female panel of distinguished experts. I'm going to briefly introduce each of our 4 panelists now, and you may refer to their bios in the handout for further details. Each of them will give an 8 to 10 minute presentation, after which we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So please take notes as we go so you can ask questions. First, we will hear from Valerie Hudson, who is a professor in Texas A&M University's Bush School of Government and Public Service, where she directs the program on women, peace, and security. A leading thinker on women, peace, and security, Valerie is a principal investigator of the Women Stats Project, which includes the largest compilation of data on the status of women in the world today. We're also pleased to have Jennifer Schuba on today's panel. Jen is a leading expert in the field of political demography and plays a broader role in helping to communicate to the broader public the impact of population trends on politics, economics, and security. Jen is an associate professor in the International Studies Department at Rhodes College in Memphis and a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. Our third speaker is Carla Koppel, who may feel the most at home on today's panel, having served as a senior advisor and interim director of the Wilson Center's Conflict Prevention Project earlier in her career. She's had an illustrious career in government as Chief Strategy Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and prior to that as USAID's first coordinator for gender equality and women's empowerment. She's currently the Vice President for the Center for Applied Conflict Transformation at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And finally, we'll hear from Sherry Goodman, who is actually at home here at the Wilson Center as a senior fellow with the Environmental Change and Security Program. Sherry was the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, as well as the founder of CNA's Military Advisory Board, which is an elite group of retired admirals and generals from across the U.S. Armed Forces that provides analysis on pressing national security challenges. Valerie, we'll begin with you.
Okay. Take this little clicker thing with me. And this wonderful young man is going to tell me how I'm going to
bring my slides up. I'm delighted to be here. What a terrific panel. And when Lauren extended the invitation, I was just thrilled to learn who was on it. So you're going to have, excuse me, I think a wide-ranging view today. Oh, it'll be just a moment. Okay. I'm actually going to start at the big, high, meta, abstract level. And I think each successive speaker will kind of bring us down more concretely until we're able to talk about practical matters on the ground. There we go. Very good. So the prompt that we were given was, what sort of keeps women, what keeps women excluded from security decision making? So I'm going to approach it from a very macro level here. I'd like to start by highlighting a couple of pieces of research that have been done. At the macro level of analysis, consider that studies have shown that women's subordination is significantly linked to propensity to be involved in intra and interstate conflict, propensity to use violence first in such a conflict, propensity to break treaty obligations and flout international norms. And at the micro level, we see something interesting and parallel to that. Consider that survey research has shown that individuals with more gender unequal beliefs are also significantly more hostile to other nations and also to minority groups within their own country. So the question is, what do those two sets of research findings kind of mean? What's the connection? So over the last 3.5 years, we've been doing research for the U.S. Department of Defense under the Minerva Initiative that asks that very question. What is the connection? And so we would like to put forth that the very first political order is the sexual political order. And what we mean by that is that the relationship between the two halves of society, men and women, molds the society, its governance, and its behavior. Think about it. In fact, some of my students, I say, think about it if you were a video game designer. And I told you that the parameters were there'd be two groups, approximately 50-50, neither of which could reproduce without the other. The future, in essence, literally depends upon their interaction. Okay, so what sorts of alternatives could there be in terms of relationships between their two groups? All right, so let's take 4 political dimensions of this relationship. We could ask about status in the context of sexual difference. And we could say, will these two groups be engaging each other as equals or as subordinates and superordinates? So we can imagine a spectrum of society whose choices place them nearer to the left-hand side, where these two groups are unequal, or more to the right-hand side, where they're viewed as equals. But we could also ask another political question: how about decision-making in the context of that sexual difference? Will decisions in the society be made primarily by one group or by both? And again, we can imagine societies arraying themselves along a spectrum. Left-hand side, only one of those two groups makes the decisions, and the right-hand side, where both groups would. A third political dimension would be conflict resolution in the context of this difference. If the two groups disagree, how would that disagreement be resolved? Can one group be coerced to provide what is required for group survival and persistence against their will? And again, a spectrum. Left-hand side, violent coercion of one group by the other is permissible, even sanctioned. And towards the right-hand side, nonviolent resolution, compromise would be necessary. And the final political dimension would be resource distribution in the context of that sexual difference. With regard to resources necessary for survival and persistence, food, land, weapons, children, wealth, will one group control those, or will they be controlled in a shared fashion? And again, left-hand side controlled by one group, right-hand side controlled by both groups. So 4, in a sense, political dimensions to this original male-female relationship. So when that first political order is based on the left-hand side choices in that spectrum, women will not be able to influence security decision-making because what we call the security provision mechanism of the society itself is based on specifically disempowering women in this realm. So we call this left side first political order the patrilineal fraternal syndrome. And we furthermore put forth that there are two primary ways to ensure group security in the 21st century. One mechanism, security provision mechanism, is fairly new. We call that states, centralized powers with a monopoly of force within the society. But the much more ancient security provision mechanism that has been utilized in human history is actually extended kin networks based on patrilineal and fraternal lines. Such networks, these male-bonded kin networks, solve the problem of male cooperation within a group by creating fraternity among those men. And so if you've served in Afghanistan, if you've served in Iraq, if you've served in many different places, you will know this to be true, is the real power in the society are these extended kin networks. You may even want to call them clans or tribes. Where states are weak or weakening, this syndrome will resurge as a security provision mechanism because it enables fraternity that facilitates ready male cooperation against external threat. But, and this is the talk I'm not going to give you today, the syndrome aggravates insecurity and instability, producing high levels of corruption, government ineffectiveness, asset stripping, extremism, and the constant threat of annihilative clan violence. And in fact, we were able, as a result of the DoD funding, to have a fairly comprehensive data collection effort that will show that when this syndrome is present, all of these dysfunctional sequelae follow. And of course, this excludes women from any influential role in security decision-making, even societal decision-making. So how do you see this society's dependence on this syndrome as a security provision mechanism? We suggest that the easiest way to see it is to look at the situation of women, because that will tell you what the first political order in that society is. So this system cannot exist without systematically subordinating women to the interests of males, to the interests of the patriline. So we put forward for Minerva a diagram of 11 interlocking variables that we believe describe that syndrome. And this diagram shows how they are all connected, but you can't read that in the back, so I'm going to give you the list. These are the variables that we look at in order to gauge how strongly the society is dependent upon this syndrome for security. Levels of violence against women, women's property and inheritance rights in practice, patrilocal marriage, son preference and sex ratio alteration, age of marriage for girls, degree of inequity in family law and customs, bride price, dowry, prevalence and legality of polygyny, societal sanction for femicide, cousin marriage, and legal exemption for rapists who offer to marry their victims. All right? It is this syndrome, okay, that creates that patrilineal fraternal bond by specifically disempowering women and making sure that all those left-hand political dimensions are in place. All right, we've mapped this syndrome for you, and I think it's probably no surprise that this mapping also elucidates what we might call the shatter belts, or the areas of most problematic state behavior as well. So to conclude, because I know I only have 10 minutes, but I'm happy to take many questions. And I have additional slides should you ask. So in addition to aggravating the security profile of a nation, and I'd like to again tell you that I could give you an amazing amount of results on that. Reliance on the syndrome means women face stiff challenges in having any influence in security decision making. To change this, right, it's not sufficient to have, say, quotas for women at the table. You must disrupt the syndrome. This was brought home to me viscerally about 10 years ago when we were entertaining one of the first Afghan female members of parliament. And we were having lunch, and I was gushing about how wonderful it was that she was so empowered as a member of parliament. And she turned to me with great sadness in her eyes, and she said, "Valerie, you don't understand. I could go home today, and my husband could divorce me immediately by saying, 'I divorce you 3 times.' I would lose custody of my children." She said to me, "Even if my husband does not divorce me, I may have no say in when my daughters marry or whom they marry. Right? If my husband divorced me, where would I go in my society? Where could I be safe?" So she looked at me and she said, "How empowered am I, Valerie, really?" And I thought to myself, that's that first political order. Unless you disrupt that syndrome, you cannot change security decision-making within the society. And so we need to attend to that as well as getting women to the table. So that's kind of where I'd like to end up, and I hope I haven't taken too much time. Thank you.
So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask each presenter a question right after their presentation before we move on to the next, once you have a chance to take your seat. So Valerie, given that dichotomy that you laid out at the beginning of your talk, would it be fair to say that strong and centralized, maybe even authoritarian states are the answer if we want to move away from a more kin-based patrilineal fraternal syndrome?
Certainly strong states, right? Because what we've found is that when states weaken, whoa, this reliance on extended kin networks comes roaring back. And all you need to do is look at the Arab uprising to see that happen in spades, right? If you ask the women of Libya what their situation is now compared to what it was before the uprising, what would they say to you? What would women in other Arab uprising nations, with the possible exception of Tunisia, say, right? We saw how, especially in places like Libya, the tribal kin networks roared back as the real power within society and brought back that old syndrome once more. In fact, even if we were talking about the Libyan transitional government, do you know what the very, very first thing that was on their mind to do was, when they came into power, quote unquote power? It was to re-legalize polygamy. And you say to yourself, wait, that was the first thing you thought you needed to do? All right, how could that even be? But if what we're talking about with that syndrome is correct, what they're doing is reestablishing that syndrome. Any parts that were taken out or missing, they're putting back in so that that kin network can be strengthened. And I hope that answers your question.
Great. Well, thank you. And we do hope to have more time for discussion of your presentation at the conclusion of the 4. Jen, turning to you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the way that I'm going to connect with this, when I think about Valerie's research, I think of it in terms of a way that society members treat each other and how that can connect to conflict. And the framework that I'm going to give us is a bit different. It's an age structural framework. And the way I always think about this and teach about this is to think about each society in terms of a picture, a visual. And we're taking a snapshot of the age structure in society or other demographic characteristics in that society. And then looking on the other side, another picture of political, economic, social outcomes. And we're putting these two things together to see where they connect. When we talk about demographic age structure, a lot of times high fertility societies come up, and that is what I'll focus on today. But I want to, at the outset, ask this question about, is a high fertility society bad? Is this something to be avoided? And I would argue to you that there's no demographic characteristic, there's no age structure that's inherently good or bad, but it's the way that they operate within a larger context that really matters. So I'm a political scientist, and I'm trained as a political scientist, and I'm a political scientist who uses demography. So my focus is always on things like political institutions. Who has a right to vote? Who doesn't have a right to vote? Who gets to inherit land? Some of the things that Valerie looks at, and so on. So we're not really focused on saying, okay, any society with a total fertility rate of 4 and above is bad. Everything bad's going to happen there. We want to overlay that with these political institutions as well. Okay, so high fertility and conflict. Well, it does so happen that a lot of societies with very high fertility do tend to be the ones in conflict. And when we're talking today about women's roles in peace and security, I can't help but think of women and their roles in the family, and women as their roles as mothers. And societies with very high fertility are the least likely to be democratic. They're the most likely to be embroiled in conflict. And they're actually some of the countries in the world today where the United States and its allies are most interested. Countries like Niger, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen. Niger is the youngest country on the planet. A total fertility rate, meaning the average number of children born to a woman in her lifetime, of 7. That's the highest in the world. Half of the population is under the age of 15. And if you want to think about it in terms of a magical spaceship or a magical bus that could transport you to a society in the world, and you get off the bus and you look around and what do you see? Mostly you would see children, adolescents, versus going to a place like Japan where the median age is 46, and it would be very different. So it's easy for us to picture the challenges of governance in a society like that. Afghanistan. The United States has something like 16,000 troops there still. In the time that the United States has been in Afghanistan, the population of Afghanistan has gone from 21 million to almost 36 million. Already today, the very first generation of women who were born under this U.S. occupation are mothers. And I think that's really striking and is left out of the conversation. We're talking about, people who are having children at a very young age, and they have not known another existence other than the United States being there. That's got to matter for our conversations about security. Yemen is a place where the United States, we see headlines that'll say, U.S. drone strike kills 5 people in Yemen. There are 3,000 births a day in Yemen. So what I want to do is introduce or emphasize to the U.S. national security community the idea that focusing billions of dollars on a purely military lens, a purely military solution to conflict, really leaves out underlying characteristics of the society and challenges that mean the U.S. Will be involved in there for decades to come, that nothing is really changing there. Even Nigeria should be much more on the United States radar because we're looking at a country where the population goes from 180 million now to 400 million by 2050, bigger than the United States. Somalia is growing at 3% a year. This even plays into thinking about global refugee flows and so on. Now, I'm not talking about population control at all. We're talking about family planning. So as I started by saying nothing is inherently good or bad, the women who have 7 children are not to be vilified. We're not to see this as a problem that we want to solve sitting over here in the West, in my little jacket in Washington, D.C. It's empowering women to make those choices for themselves about when to have births. Do you want to be 14 and have a child, or was that imposed on you? Did you mean to have 7 children by the time you were 25, or were you pressured to do so by your family or your husband? And so access to family planning makes a very, very big difference. There's always going to be preference for different family sizes. Even among those of us in this room, we have preferences for different family sizes, but we also have access to health care that gives us the ability to make those choices. choices. I'm also not talking about abortion. So this is what's tough about bringing up this issue in national security community or even in the United States. That is the first thing that pops into some people's minds. Oh, she's definitely talking about abortion. Not at all. Pretend like that doesn't even exist as an option. You can still have this conversation. You're talking about healthcare and you're talking about choice of timing. For example, just yesterday morning, I was listening to NPR, and one of the reporters had just talked to a 20-year-old Rohingya woman who is, displaced, and she's just found out she was pregnant with her second child, and she was so devastated because she said, why on earth would I, who have no home, choose at 20 years old to have my second child? And that's the woman we're talking about here. But when women, as we go on to the next two panelists, we'll start to talk about women as individuals participating in peace and security. And I would say it connects to what I'm talking about as well, because when women don't have control over their fertility, they can't participate in peace and security because they're frankly busy doing other things. And if anybody in here has kids, I have 2 preschool boys. It just incredibly hard. I don't know how those with more have done it. Truly don't know. So what does this mean that we can do? This conversation is a difficult one to land among policymakers because, for example, the United States has spent about $700 million on girls' education in Afghanistan since the year 2002, and Afghanistan still ranks as one of the world's 10 worst places in terms of female education. So it's not as simple as that. But there's a paper out recently that one of our colleagues, Rich Sinkata, has done through Carnegie that talks about Iran and their fertility transition, and I think that can be instructive. Some of you may know that Iran is an outlier in terms of fertility for the area. They went through what we call a demographic transition from high fertility and high mortality to low very quickly. In fact, they went in the period of only 20 years from a total fertility rate of 6.5 to 2. So that would be like taking Niger and turning it into Norway in just 20 years. And how did they do that? It wasn't through coercion, because it's possible to do that through coercion. That is not what I'm advocating. They did it through the public health infrastructure. So they moved to a point where 90% of the population lived within 2 kilometers of a family planning service delivery site. And that other 10% who didn't live within 2 kilometers were serviced by mobile clinics that would go out to the rural areas. So they just said, here it is. And they educated people as well. And it is an educated society, so there's not just one variable here. But I think it's an interesting case because we're also talking about a culture that's different from the West, so that's useful, and yet we still see total fertility falling. So where does this take us? Well, we have within political demography what, again, our colleague Rich has labeled the age structural maturity thesis. That's kind of a new label that he's put on it, but it's basically to say that when you look at that picture of a society that I talked about at the beginning, you take a snapshot of what it looks like, and you see that the center of gravity, where Niger's is super low and Japan's is super high at older ages, moves upwards as women start to have fewer children and the population lives longer. These societies start to become more peaceful, more democratic, more prosperous. And so what we want to think about is facilitating that demographic transition so that the world could be a more peaceful and prosperous and secure place. And that's it for me. So I'm good.
Thanks, Jen. It's not actually it.
Oh.
I do have a question. So you opened your talk with the rather provocative question, are high fertility countries bad? Is that a bad thing? And you gave the very reasonable response that no, it's context dependent. So to play devil's advocate a little bit, are you aware of any examples of high fertility countries that have succeeded in sustaining democratic and peaceful outcomes over the long term?
Are you?
I'm not.
I know.
Utah.
Right, I know. So my thought actually, Valerie, was, well, there are families that make it work, and then I went upwards. I'm like, there are communities that make it, and then states like within countries that make it work. I'm not But I'm always so cautious not to just put the blame. And, we have women, peace, and security as a panel. I think it's all too easy to say, well, if those women didn't have all those kids, then we would have a peaceful world. That's not the conclusion I think we want to come to at all, is blaming women for this. I think what Valerie points to are these larger structures within which women live that set them up for that. So it's not a coincidence that we can't really think of any examples, but it's not those individuals' fault.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Carla.
Thanks so much. First of all, it is a little bit like coming home. We were talking earlier when I arrived about the changes in the furniture and lighting and the room. So it's great to be here, and it's always great to come to the Wilson Center. I think that it's wonderful to hear this conversation because I think the analytical frame that's been set up is a really interesting one for a robust exchange. I will pivot a bit the conversation from that frame to my experience working on how you attempt to move the needle from inside and outside of government on the issues related to women, peace, and security. And I think what you'll see, and I'll try to bring this forward a little bit, is how some of the refrains from these two presentations come through in what we've been trying to do in the policy environment, but haven't necessarily had complete success. And so I think then the question is how you carry this forward. The arc of the narrative around women, peace, and security obviously goes way back, but if we start with the creation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 as a marker, it really is the codification of a lot of work by particularly non-governmental activists in a few countries to begin to put in policy and guidance. And for me, it was when I began working in this field just after the passage of that resolution. And the focus in that early period was really on how you bring a piece of paper to life and make it something that sparks what ultimately became a large body of resolutions. I won't go through all those numbers, but if you think about the number of UN Security Council resolutions that you can name by number, there are very few. And so it's an important tool for moving the narrative forward. And obviously people like Valerie predate that resolution by a lot in terms of her work in the area. But from a policymaking perspective, it's important. And then you see the beginning of coalitions of women advocating for their own voice. And in fact, I mention that in part because one of the first I was involved in was on the heels of the beginning of the war in Iraq, when we brought women leaders to the United States in partnership with the Wilson Center, actually. And the reason I mention that moment in time is because it plays exactly to the first question that was posed to Valerie, which was, what was the first thing that the Iraqi Governing Council wanted to do after it came to power, and it was to withdraw the personal status law. And that was when the 3 female Governing Council members were out of town advocating for their own empowerment broadly in the globe. So it was indicative of exactly this kind of trend to move things back. And the other example I would raise was in Syria, when you see the economic well-being of Syrians plummet, what immediately starts to increase is the rates of child marriage. Right. And so those triggering events really do lead to the kinds of dynamics that Valerie's talking about. So for me, I'm working outside of government, and then I have the tremendous honor of being asked to come into USAID to create the National Action Plan. And for somebody like me who's really about how you make that policy change, that really is a rare opportunity, right? You're advocating for something and then you're brought into government to actually be that change itself. Very interesting, because what we tried to do within the U.S. government was have a national action plan, but to nest that national action plan in a broader set of policies and strategies that would try to encourage some of the transformation that is being talked about this morning. So you have the gender policy that's created at USAID prior to the National Action Plan. You have a gender-based violence strategy that crosses the State Department and USAID. You have a child marriage vision for moving that agenda forward, all in the hopes that by creating a policy to counter trafficking in persons, all in the hope that what you're doing is you're creating a fabric that is enabling you to create change, that is transformative and that really gets at some of these norms that exist within these countries, and that are buttressed by a growing body of evidence. Because at this point, there's really very little argument that it doesn't make a difference to bring women into peace processes when you see the double-digit increase in the durability of peace agreements when women are included. And you fast forward then to this past fall, new administration, new Congress, where you have passage of the Women, Peace, and Security Law, and its signature by President Trump. And that you have now codified this both in terms of policy guidance and law within the U.S. context and in many countries around the world. And yet, the statistics are quite damning if you look at the role of women in decision-making positions. So most recent research I've seen is that women are still only 9% of negotiators, only 4% of witnesses and signatories to peace accords, and only 2% of mediators. So how do you compare the incredible body of international and national law and policy on this agenda with a growing body of really incontrovertible evidence that this makes a difference, juxtaposed with a series of really intransigent conflicts around the world, where we're not applying particularly creative solutions like bringing in other stakeholders and other voices into the process, and a lack of progress regarding the agenda writ large, and so you're not really answering the mail when it comes to the unmet need in these countries. And so really I would pivot then to say, what are the lessons from this? Because I think if you look at the process of change, whether it's in terms of the analytical frame, the research, or the work within government, and it's not just U.S. government, it's governments around the world to move this forward, and yet you see remarkably little traction on this agenda over what is now over 15 years of work in different realms. I think there are some really important lessons, and then there are some really important next steps. First, the lessons. I think that there are some really important good lessons. So, for example, the fact that we do know what UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is, and that it's moved this agenda forward in important ways, is relevant, because what it says is that's an important triggering event and it's an important tool, and that if we're applying this going forward, we still need to utilize those tools to breathe life into these issues. The second is that it really is important to connect the dots in the ways that the previous two speakers have done, because that's what gives you the full set of issues that you need to bring to bear on an issue, on a topic, in terms of moving the process forward. And the third positive lesson is that it's really important to be nimble in the way you address these issues, because it can at sometimes feel a bit like whack-a-mole. And even if you look at the best intended work, for example, the National Action Plan that the U.S. put in place several years ago, you see a raft of issues that were not addressed in that plan. There wasn't a discussion of addressing violent extremism, really, and the role of women in extremist movements and radicalization. There wasn't really a discussion of environmental security and climate change and how that comes to play and is juxtaposed with the National Action Plan. And so building in the means to address the different challenges as they arise will be really important. But the big takeaway also is that these kinds of moves around policies are necessary but not sufficient to make change. And they're particularly not sufficient to make durable change. So you see some progress, but you don't see the kind of broad-scale transformation that you need writ large. It's episodic. So it's from country to country. It is very much 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and that's universal. And it takes place within a broader context, and that broader context can really swamp the work that you're doing. Based on those lessons, what do you say are the next steps? And I would say that there are, I'll list 3, because 3 is a good number, but there are many, and hopefully we can discuss that in the conversation that follows. The first is you really need to push on intransigence. And what I mean by that is you have seen some important progress in key areas. I was struck, for example, when I was at USAID in the real effort and attention to combating gender-based violence in humanitarian relief operations. I don't think there was all the answers, but I'll never forget, happened to be in London when the storms hit the Philippines, and the UK Minister for International Development sat down at a ministerial level and said, okay, I really, we're point on this. How can we work with the U.S. government to really try everything we can to prevent the outbreak of gender-based violence in the response to this storm? And it really was, for me, quite remarkable to see the level of attention and interest in really looking at every tool we had available in a very concerted way. At the same time, you look at peace negotiations, and as I said earlier, you see very little movement. You really need to disaggregate and disassemble the full set of issues and look at the ones where there's not movement, and then really focus a spotlight on those and push on those. The second is you really need to measure results and impact, because it's only by looking at the data that you strengthen the case and can carry forward in creating a virtuous cycle. So when I started working on this, there really wasn't a body of data that gave you the kinds of data points I cited earlier when I was talking. Those make a difference, both in terms of the durability of peaceful solutions to conflict, and in terms of the durability of the argument, and in terms of the marginalization of women in the conversation. And so that kind of evidence accumulation is really important to the long game in this conversation. The third is that you really need to shift the incentive structure in order to see the kind of change that's in place. And part of that is the norms and the rules and the policies, but part of it really is that the carrots and sticks that are involved in changing the way people behave and changing the way people behave on a long-term basis. If you look at women, peace, and security and how this movement has progressed, you can see that a progression from making the case generally, to putting in place guidelines and policy, to beefing up the evidence that says that 35% conflicts are 35% more likely to be resolved and remain peaceful for 15 years if women are involved. That's really powerful. And then you see the beginnings of shifting norms and behaviors. But I would argue and posit, and I think this is bolstered by the previous conversation, that we haven't gotten nearly far enough, notwithstanding the evidence and the push that's been made. And so we need to dig down underneath that and use the evidence, use the incentive structure to shift the norms. And only in that way will you get the kind of long-term change that we all desire and that we think will reap benefits for the resolution of conflict and progress for fragile states around the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. You've made several very intriguing allusions to research showing that peace agreements are much more effective when women are included. I think you referenced the double-digit increase in the durability of such agreements. For those who may not be familiar with that research, is there more you can tell us about that, and in particular, what some of the causal factors may be and why women's inclusion is so effective?
So I think there are a number of factors that come into play. One is a broader point, which I think is important, whether it's women or other groups that tend not to have voices within society, which is that you need to enable the space for people to air their grievances and work through a process for addressing those. And peace negotiations are a really important moment in time for addressing gaps and dysfunction within societies, and bringing so by enabling your peace process to bring in those voices, you're far more likely to enable people to own the peace process and to have their issues addressed as part of that peace process. So one piece is about reducing the grievance factor that can lead to the resurgence of conflict. I think the second is that this is a broader base of research that simply shows that you get better solutions when you work as a broad-based team with different opinions, different expertise, and different viewpoints that are being brought into the conversation. The knowledge that is brought in, and there are myriad examples. I remember the story of the Darfurian women being brought into the 6th round of the peace negotiations, and there's a big debate raging about ownership of a river and who should get the river. And the women say, the river dried up decades ago. Really, you should not be arguing about the river. And the men who were at the negotiating table simply didn't know, because they were negotiating over it in theory, and they didn't understand what was the situation on the ground. Or the Palestinian women who I spoke with who said, the Oslo Accord lines were drawn incorrectly. They divided people from their farmland. They divided kids from their schools. But it wasn't because the people who were negotiating intended to do that. It was because they didn't know. And so they created grievances simply based on a lack of information. Or the Ugandan women I worked with who talked about looping back to communities to talk about the peace agreement so that those communities could own that peace agreement. And because there was a marginalization in the early stages, the communities didn't even know what was going on in those negotiations. And so an entire component of the process, which is bringing along the local victims in conflict and civilians, wasn't taking place because those folks hadn't been involved in the talks. So whether it's the process or the substance, it's clear that bringing in these different configurations of players offers you a better peace deal.
Great, thanks. Sherry.
Okay, great. Well, it's wonderful to be here with you all this morning. And I'm going to wrap this up by coming at this from a slightly different perspective. I'm going to talk about women as warriors, less as victims, although that's certainly, obviously historically the case. But I think we need to, both because of my own experience in national security and in defense, and because I think we have to model and sort of be the change we want to see around the world, women as warriors and as leaders in society, I think is incredibly important. But in a positive way. And I want to start with kind of 3 stories, if you will, about people, one of whom is in this room. We have our Air Force fellow, Aries Menser, Colonel Menser, who serves in the United States Air Force, Colonel, and is among the cadre of women that is leading the change in our military today, in uniform and in service. And we're very blessed to have her here, Aries, as a fellow this year. And she's also part of leading the change of how women and men within our armed forces have opportunities to continue to serve in their careers and support their families. And I think that's incredibly important. Last night, I'll just tell you, now I'm going to tell you the story of Margaret Mullins, who was actually, I met her when she was a Georgetown student and a babysitter. She babysat for my 3 children. I live in the area. When she was a student, she graduated in 2010. She wanted to serve her country, and she was very impressed with and saw the opportunity for female engagement teams in Iraq and Afghanistan to make a difference in the fight. She joined the Army, became an intel officer, and served with distinction for 5 years, and now is at the Woodrow Wilson Princeton School and is among those in the generation who wants to lead and serve the country as a civilian national security leader in the future. And then I'll tell you my own story. I was the first female professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee in the mid-1980s. And at a time when, it was not a gender or otherwise diverse staff on the Hill in most places. And in 1993, I became the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense. I was in the first wave of women to serve in significant numbers as a civilian in the Department of Defense in that era. We used to joke that we could barely fill. We would sometimes try to see if we could have the women senior political appointees gather for lunch, and we could barely fill a table in the dining hall for lunch with enough women at the time. And now, in recent years, it would take multiple tables, and that's great. And I had 3 children while I was serving in the Department of Defense for 8 years, at a time when there was no family leave, no pumping stations as there are today, no direct child care available, at least for civilians. Or as Ari said, if you want child care when you're in the military, you got to plan a year in advance to get into that child care center. So we've made a lot of progress in the last quarter century in being able to integrate. Now, today, on the Armed Services and Defense Appropriations Committees, they've had female staff directors. There are, a number of female leaders in the Department of Defense. There was an Air Force Secretary back in 1993, and there's a female Air Force Secretary now, although we haven't yet had a female Secretary of Defense, but I think that's coming. There are many other nations, mostly Nordic nations, that have had female leaders in the national security space, both Norway, Finland, a number of others. I actually remember meeting the female Finnish Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense in the 1990s, and the first Norwegian female submarine commander, also in the 1990s. The current Secretary of the Air Force has said, you can't be it if you don't see it. Aries conveyed that from a talk she went to with her recently, and I think that's really true. So now we're finally in a position where we are beginning to reach a critical mass. Although when you look at the numbers, so if you take civilian leaders in the Department of Defense, I think in the career ranks, at certain levels, there is critical mass if you measure it by studies that have been done over the years. Starting with work, if you go back and look at work that was done in the 1990s, 1980s really, starting at Harvard Business School, by a professor named Richard Hackman, looking at how orchestras integrate. And he compared orchestras in Germany, West Germany at the time, and East Germany. And East German orchestras actually had far greater gender integration and resulted in much more equitable decision-making, whereas West German orchestras during the Cold War were less integrated. And that kind of research has carried through to work that's been done that shows that if you needs about a third of a group to have critical mass and sort of change the structure of the group, 20 to 30%, or about a third. So if you look at our armed forces today, for example, and both Ellie Thompson, who is our internist here in Aries, and I discussed this yesterday, you have about just under 20% of women in the United States Air Force today, but the other services, and you won't be surprised that the Marine Corps has the lowest number of women in it. So we're beginning to make a change in the culture, and that's why, getting rid of the combat exclusion has been so important, not only for allowing women to serve in those particular functions and to compete for those jobs, but also for the full sort of integration across the decision-making and part of the culture, as I think we've heard reflected in the other discussions here this morning. Now, so there's progress being made in our military. We now have a female combatant commander. We've had a female vice chief, Admiral Howard. We've had, actually, Army had the first 4-star back in 2008, but you can still count the numbers on your hand. And hopefully that won't be the case forever. Now, the third dimension of this is really the military family story, the support story, or as the military like to call it, SINC home, Commander-in-Chief home, which, because in a successful career, as I know each of us have found, and most of you, whether you're serving in the military or in civilian life, if you have any professional aspirations, you need to balance your work and your family. And traditionally, the female spouse was the one supporting the male spouse's military career. And that has, resulted in most of the spouses in the military having had to subordinate their own careers. But increasingly, you have families, like we have in civilian life, where both spouses are working. And that is beginning, so there's been a major effort over the last decade to create more opportunities for women to continue their careers, breaking down barriers for service. But we still see it reflected in the fact that among military families, many of them are unwilling to recommend service to their own children, and that many military spouses are still underemployed and have inadequate child care. And then there's another challenge here about the increasing isolation of our military from civilian life, which I think is an important part as we talk about women and war in our own culture, having ended sort of a decade, coming to the end of a decade where we've had so much of our military deployed. We need to sort of better understand that civilian-military relationship, which I think is very important. So the lessons that I would say, I've learned in my course of my career working across the national security community, and let me also observe in response to something that Jennifer said about the lack of attention to some of the security challenges we face in countries like Niger and Nigeria, where the populations are exploding. Those are cases not only of population challenge, but also resource scarcity, and ones where you have a confluence of factors of exploding population and also resources, water and food, that aren't able to support that population, whether it's Lake Chad that has shrunk by almost 90% in last decades, which has fueled the terrorism that's been rampant in that area, or conflicts over water in that region and elsewhere. But to sort of sum up, 1 minute, okay, we need opportunity. So, and we have increasing opportunities, but we need more. I think the focus on data and facts and evidence, even in this time of fact-free, facts and evidence do matter. So I applaud the work both that the Wilson Center Global Women's Leadership Program has done to provide more facts about women in power across a range of sectors. I think that's very important, and the work that many of you are doing as well. And then also the advocacy, the need to continue to model and be the change, and also to support that next generation of leaders across various sectors.
Thanks, Sherry. So although women still compose very much a minority in the U.S. Armed Forces, you've shared with us the good news that those participation rates are increasing. Do you think that as women have increased their roles in the military, that's affected our operations on gender issues in the countries where they are serving?
That's a great question. I'm seeing Cornelia, who has perhaps researched this, and maybe you want to speak to this. I would say certainly at the tactical edge it has, where women are directly in the front lines of engagement. Whether it's affected our policy yet at the highest levels is, I think we're beginning to see the inclusion of the whole gender, peace, and security into strategy and policy making. And I do think that women will tend to look at more holistic solutions to a range of conflicts. That doesn't mean there aren't continuing to be resource constraints, which I think is what partly hampers the United States and others in trying to trying to have better policies to address these intractable problems, because it's not just provision of armed forces and security, it's also, as we've discussed, this kind of development and non-military assistance that needs to transform a society, whether it's education, roads, water, sewage, et cetera. But I might ask Cornelia if she wants to comment on that question, since I see you nodding your head.
Just wait just a moment for a microphone.
I would just say while the microphone gets there, I think there are two levels on which you can look at it. One is there also have been all-female brigades of peacekeepers that have gone into countries, and you do see analysis that says it does make a difference. The orientation of those teams is different. The way they interact with communities is different, and it does have an impact on those relationships. So those are not U.S. troops necessarily, although sometimes they may be, but not the all-female brigades are not. They're actually South Asian. And then I would say there are certain, like the female engagement teams that exist in Afghanistan and Iraq, which were specifically geared towards how you interact with local populations and were comprised of females, and there are positive and negative dimensions that have come from that, but that's one specific manifestation of female troops.
Those are
on the
those
ground.
female engagement teams trying to work directly in those patrilineal societies.
I can actually add something here. I spent the first 6 months in Australia as a fellow at the Fulbright fellow at the Australian National University, and the ADF has been very proactive. They stood up their first ever gender advisors training course this past May, and I was asked to be there, and it was really quite extraordinary. 2/3 of the officers being trained were men and not women, and the ADF has said that all Australian military operations, will have gender advisors. And there will be a gender advisor to whoever the commander of the operation is, as well as gender advisors in the units on the ground. And so I think that there are some militaries that have really tried to mainstream this and make it a part of all military operations. The Australians insisted that the bilateral exercise that they have with the U.S. called Talisman Sabre would have gender injects to that scenario, that the gender advisors would have to begin to, coordinate more fully with the other officers in order to handle these gender injects. So I think there's a lot of progress being made, but it's very uneven across the globe.
Okay, I think Sherry has mentioned one of our audience members. Is it Colonel Mentor? Colonel?
No. This is right. Cornelia Weiss.
Cornelia
Who's
Weiss.
also an Air Force
Okay,
officer.
thank you. Could you tell us about your experience?
I'd be happy to. And if I could also squeeze in a question for Dr. Hudson.
Cornelia?
So first, my question for Dr. Hudson, on the micro level, reliance on the syndrome, do you think, for example, institutions like the military, if we would on the micro level, if we want to demonstrate and be who we are, show the change, if we could also incorporate gender inequality beliefs in terms of selection, hiring, and promotion as our criteria. So that's my question for you.
I think you've answered it. What a great suggestion.
I think there are numerous examples of women being there in uniform, making a difference. For example, I was in a fellowship in New Zealand looking at their military, and one of their proudest achievements is in Bougainville. And so the commander, the New Zealand commander, had a two-pronged approach. One was on gender, and he will tell you over and over again that that made a difference. And you will have evidence out there that that it made a difference. Who was asked, who was listened to, and frequently, if there was an all male, the women were not listened to, and it affected security. Certainly, from my own experience, for example, I was deployed to Colombia for 1.5 years. When I got there, it was I worked with all male. During the time that I was there, there was a change. First female ever to head the Colombian Military Justice Corps, and the first woman to head the Colombian Military Justice School. And not to denigrate men, but these women were vastly superior, and we were able to get things accomplished. I'm thinking right now of Admiral Herb, who heads up the Inter-American Defense College, and I would submit to you, she has been able to get on the agenda for an every 2-year meeting of the defense ministers of this hemisphere on the agenda about women in security and having gender perspective within operations. So those are just 3 examples. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are many out there.
Thank you, Cornelia. Did Valerie or anyone else on the panel want to weigh in on that question?
I'll just add that USIP has been working with the State Department on adding sexual exploitation and abuse and masculinities training for all the peacekeeping training that we undertake, which is over 1,000 peacekeepers per year deploying across Africa. And so there's much more attention to understanding what's behind some of the rulemaking. What we found when we did the analysis was that actually people didn't quite, a lot of the troops didn't understand where the lines were. There's sort of just this statement, you should not engage in sexual exploitation and abuse. And they didn't know how that plays out within a local context. What does that mean for consensual relationships? What does it mean in terms of the age of people there? What are power dynamics within societies? How do they modulate around that in ways that make sense or don't make sense? They had many questions that were not being answered because all they were being done was handed a policy. So now there's been an investment in multi-day training for these troops from African nations deploying to other African nations, and it'll be interesting to see over time what kind of difference that makes.
Which we're still dealing with in the U.S., right? Everything you're saying, I'm thinking, oh, that sounds like the news.
Great.
In Hollywood, doesn't it?
Before we turn it back over to the audience, I just want to remark on how impressed I am by the breadth of topics that we've covered in these presentations, all related to women, peace, and security, but we've heard about women whose lives are challenged by highly patriarchal gender norms, by women who are agents of peace, successful agents of peace, and perhaps my favorite phrase, women as warriors. So I will turn it back to the audience in just a minute and open it up to questions, but before we do, I do have one overarching question I hope everyone might want to weigh in on. So your presentations covered a range of topics, macro, micro, but there was a key theme throughout, which is the central role of women's empowerment as a linchpin in political participation. But Jen, I think you characterized this as an issue that is, quote, hard to land among policymakers. And I would love to hear from the 4 of you in your expert careers, what strategies have you found to be most successful in convincing decision makers that women's empowerment is genuinely a hard security issue that they should care about and not just something they should pay lip service to?
I'll go first. I entered this field actually from the more conventional traditional security studies field. Back in the late 90s. And as I surveyed the field at that time, I realized that we had just terrific scholars doing research, but the research was all qualitative. It was deconstruction of texts, it was compilation of case studies, and that was too easy to dismiss. And so at that time, I actually thought, how could you change a policymaker's mind on these things? And I realized that you would have to have data. And you would have to have large N sizes, and you would have to do rigorous statistical analysis in order to figure out what difference the treatment of women made to national security, what those linkages were. And so, you know, the rest of the time since the late 90s, I've been involved in compiling a humongous data set, and God bless the U.S. Department of Defense. We were able to, you know, increase the amount of data by over 20%. And then to run the kinds of analyses that would enable you to say things like, if you include a woman at the table, right, the agreement is 35% more likely to last for 15 years. Until decision makers, I think, are able to hear these kinds of rigorous empirical analyses, I think it's still all too easy to consider women in security as a soft and thereby dismissible or low priority issue.
Data is definitely one of them. Another is what not to say. So I did spend 2 years at the Department of Defense myself, and in order to have the message land, I don't think it's being disingenuous. I hope it's not. But I really start from a purely hard security perspective and talk about countries where the U.S. currently is spending a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort, and then bringing in the demographic piece. I have always found that policymakers and decision makers are very interested in demographics. They believe that it matters, but the causal chain is really, really long. So to go from something like family planning or availability of contraception, let's take it all the way down there, to civil war is a lot of steps in between and not at all useful to a policymaker. So being able to take different pieces of that and bring it to a much more narrow conversation is very helpful. And the way that you would do that, for example, would be saying, looking, you know, in this society, that's where case studies still do matter. I mean, I think the data part is important, but pointing to cases that have come out of the demographic transition, you know, looking at Tunisia or looking at East Asia in particular, and the way that those countries transitioned from high fertility to low fertility societies and what that did in terms of their global power and economic power is very convincing to the leadership. But the way that the U.S. government is set up is not conducive to including something like family planning and hard security. It's just not. And that's not really anything that I certainly could have any control over. People absolutely bristle in the hard security circles when you bring up something like family planning. It doesn't matter if you were to show that that would be the single most effective factor to change global peace. It is just not within that purview. And I'm not sure how to change that. That's not my job.
Well, you can't drop a bomb to solve family planning issues. Right? So,
No.
in hard security
Please don't.
circles. Right? I mean, look, for me, I spent most of my career avoiding or ignoring women issues in national security because that was not the way I was going to advance my own career, nor would either any of my cohort. That was a way to get sidelined and not be effective as a policymaker. So if you want to accumulate power and make a change, you've got, and you're in the system, and I've spent most of my life sort of as a policymaker and a decision maker or a lawyer, and not, more on the inside than the outside. You've got to figure out how to change the system from the inside. Now, decision making moves at the speed of trust. We all know that, right? So what I think women bring to this that is a little bit different is that we are more often likely to build those relationships of trust. Now, this is an overgeneralization, and I have lots of men that I have a great deal of trust in, and I think men can build trusting relationships. But I think that those, there's some great stories about when the United States Senate, for a brief period, had about 20 women senators. on both sides of the aisle, they had a sort of critical mass of leadership in the Senate that enabled them to have one of the most successful legislative sessions in the United States Congress. And they worked together. Senator Murkowski would have a potluck dinner and say, I'm going to bring the salmon from Alaska and you all bring something else. And people said, well, how could senators do that? They don't cook. And they should, but everyone figured out something to do, right? So, we know how to walk and chew gum. We've been multitasking our whole lives as professionals and mothers. So, the idea in problem solving and decision making is how do you get to yes? And there are various theories about negotiations. One that was very popular when I was, in the early stages of my career, which was developed by men at Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School, was this idea of getting to yes, of changing from sort of a positional bargaining approach to one that's interest-based and appreciates the interests of the two parties. Kind of what would it take you to agree to a particular solution? And I think, that as mothers and caregivers and protectors, we are instinctively often trained to put ourselves in the shoes of the other, right? So we don't have, and it's not that men can't do this, but, we know that, when our child is feeling bad, why do they feel, bad? So that idea of being able to appreciate both sides and see all around the circle, I think, is very important. And then also, finally, I would add to kind of speak the language and couch the change in the language that appeals to the particular community you're in. So I've spent a lot of my life trying to integrate environmental security considerations into national security. And so I look for ways to frame those issues in ways that make sense in national security, hence the framing that I developed for climate change as a threat multiplier, which is sort of a national security type frame that makes it more accessible, climate as a threat. But there are other, and that's just one example, but there are other ways to think about how to take these issues that are sometimes called soft security, population and dynamics that Jennifer works on, and sort of integrate them. The Marine Corps, for example, they always start their strategy by looking at what's happening in the littoral, right? They talk about what's happening along coastlines, because that's where they think about operating amphibious landings. So they have always been concerned about the growth of urban areas and populations in the littoral. So if you frame sort of the demographic issue about where they think about fighting, for example, or having to deploy, that enables you to have a conversation that is different, and it begins on their terms, but then, or the way, the language that they're accustomed to using, and then expands into new territory.
I think the data is important. We talked about that. I think Sherry's point about pushing from inside and outside are really important. I would add three things. I think the one is you need to buy down the risk for the policymakers. Right now, if somebody were to say, okay, now I'm going to set the peace table with all women, or I'm going to have an all-female fighting force, that's a very risky position to stake. And until it becomes less risky for a policymaker to stick their neck out and do things differently, you're going to have very few people willing to do it. The second is you need to make it normal. And the example I would use is Rwanda. In Rwanda, they forced folks to vote for female and male candidates on separate ballots until it became normal to vote for women, as normal to vote for women as it became to vote for men. And today you have over 60% women in the parliament, and that's not an accident. It became normal voting for women as it was to vote for men, and then people were making a choice based on the merits. And I think the third is the continued public pressure. And I think you see all, and that relates to this point of inside and outside. You need to hold people accountable to these norms. The pressure needs to be public. It needs to be positive as well as negative. Gutierrez has a half-female kind of cabinet at the UN right now. That's the first time you've had 50% female leadership in the UN system. We should be singing his praises to the tops of the hillsides. So it's not always naming and shaming. Sometimes it's really complimenting and elevating. And I think that kind of that kind of modulation by the public is essential as a partner to those who are working inside government and inside organizations to make change.
Great, thank you all. I counted at least 7 discrete strategies to make these issues appeal as a hard security concern. So with that, we are going to turn it over to all of you. We invite audience members to raise your hands to ask questions, but please do wait to speak until one of our colleagues brings you a microphone. And we would appreciate it if you would preface your question by sharing your name and affiliation. Please keep your question fairly brief so that others have a chance. As a reminder, this event is being webcast and recorded, and we're going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time so that all of our panelists have a chance to respond in each round. I see a question at the front, and others, please feel free to raise your hands.
Do you want me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
My name is Carolyn Washington. I'm a retired Army colonel, and currently I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Buffalo in Global Gender Studies, where I focus on UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and integration within NATO militaries. I had a couple of comments to make, basically. I'm really excited, and this deals with women warriors, about the increase of numbers and opportunities with women, especially with the elimination of combat exclusion. But I believe that opportunity is in itself, an increase of women is not enough unless we work on changing the mindsets, especially within a masculinized culture like the military. A gender perspective, we actually talk about that in terms of externally, what we want to integrate into our operations as we go out to help others, but I think that we could benefit from that internally. In fact, I think it's hypocritical not to first start with a gender perspective within our military. And I was interested in your thoughts on how maybe we could change mindsets of the culture so that no matter whether it's gender or sexuality or whatever difference, that it makes it easier for someone who's not white male to fit within a military culture. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have some questions over on this side. And I do think you have to hold the microphone pretty close to your face in order for it to work.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos dos Santos. I'm the ambassador of Mozambique to the United States. I wanted to start by thanking the Wilson Center for always bringing very important issues to the discussion, and very good panelists to discuss these issues. And I've been reading a lot from Valerie, and I'm very honored to meet you. Finally, I have foreign policy analysis with me.
There's another good book called Sex and World Peace. I urge you to pick that one up.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. I was very happy to listen to the panelists on this topic. On Valerie's presentation, I saw the map, and I was not sure the analysis within it. It was about the patrilinear map, and then Africa was, I think, was brown, most brown, and I didn't know what that meant. Of course, I'm coming from Mozambique, where we have, in the southern part and central part of the country, patrilineal society. But in the southern, in the northern part of the country, it's very much matrilineal society. And I wanted to know, can we dig deeper to see what happens there, and if whether that can inform the solutions for the future. And also on the solutions, I wanted to point to the issue that you just raised, what is being done in international organizations, the UN trying to have parity, women and men. And the African Union has been practicing that since the African Union was established. You have commissioners, same number, men and women. And then some political parties, including in Mozambique, are starting to also give certain numbers. Whether that could has a strong impact, has disrupting the syndrome. That's what I wanted to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have one other question before we turn it to the panelists? This gentleman.
Thank you. Tristan Martinez, Texas A&M University. Dr. Hudson, we've communicated a few times through the Student Conference on National Affairs.
Oh, gig 'em, whoop,
Thank
and
you.
all that good stuff.
I have read the quantitative data on the impact of including women in policy and negotiations, and I entirely believe it and buy into it. I'm looking for employment right now, and I'm trying to find someone up and coming in the security diplomacy field who will be able to bring that those numbers and work for her. I was wondering if you have any people on your mind, up and coming, that you would trust and see as a shining star that I could potentially reach out to.
All right, thank you. This is a very distinguished audience. So the questions that I heard, there's a specific question for Valerie around sort of the analysis of patriarchy and how countries are classified, and then that relates to a broader question about whether matrilineal societies might serve as an example for moving forward. We have a couple other questions around the importance of changing the internal masculinized culture first, around parity in international organizations, and who else in the field, besides yourselves, are examples of researchers and professionals working on this who are rising stars?
I'm very happy to address your question. We have thought quite a lot about matrilineal systems, and that's one of the reasons we put patrilineal/fraternal. So oftentimes what we find in matrilineal systems is that the power is still not with the women themselves. It's with sons of a particular mother that have created, again, a male-centered kin network. So that's why we looked at those 11 variables that we talked about. So we looked at women's property rights, women's inheritance rights, age of marriage, polygyny, and so forth. And so what I would be very interested in looking at is, of those 11 variables that we listed on the screen, is whether the northern part of Mozambique and the southern part of Mozambique were really different, or whether they were still somewhat the same. And so I would love to exchange business cards with you so that we could explore that, because what a fabulous, if they were different, what a fabulous research project that would be. And if they were not different, what an interesting note then on the power structures even within matrilineal societies. So I think that would be great. I'll turn it back to Sherry about the warrior question.
All right. Colonel Washington, so I agree with your premise, and, you know, now I think we finally at a time, and I've learned this in part from Colonel Mentzer and others of her cohort, that women can be, women in uniform and civilian women in national defense can be explicit about their needs and the needs of family, and the need to address gender issues directly and to be more inclusive and to grow their numbers. And I think that the female leaders we're seeing, you know, this emerging cadre of 3 and 4 stars, in the services, and the female leaders are taking this directly on in a way that, we couldn't do 25 years ago. In fact, we avoided addressing because we were trying to integrate from within at that time, in a different era. But now I think it's acceptable to sort of lean in and organize. And I'm going to turn it over to Aries, talk a little bit about some of the steps that she's taking in the Air Force. But I also see this question about the military. In my generation, I could count on my hand the number of women who are like me, who have had careers in national defense and also have 3 children. In fact, we had, with Michelle Florina and myself, we used to have a occasional lunch of the women in national security with 3 children, and we were about the whole table. We had maybe 4 of us, 5 maybe. So because there hasn't been the ability to sort of have the structured childcare or to address a whole range of issues, but finally those are beginning to change, and it's now not just soldier on, but address those issues directly and try to make change in society. And I do feel that critical mass, and I'll just share my husband, who works at who was in defense with me and now runs a large federal contracting business, is very eager to hire and does hire a lot of retiring female senior leaders across the services to run sectors of the business, because it's a very successful model, and they're not only great warriors and great leaders, but they really also know how to build teams and really get things done. So, but I want to turn over to Aries, give you an opportunity to speak about your own experience.
Thank you, Sherry, not just for this opportunity, but also for your leadership. I've been here at the Wilson Center for about 6 months, and Sherry has extended so many opportunities to help grow me, not just as a fellow here at the Wilson Center, but also as a woman, as a mother, and as a wife. So thank you so much for everything you've done here, Sherry. I'd like to share with you that, excuse me, I'd like to share with you that I've served in the Air Force for 20 years, and my path in the Air Force, my rise to become a fellow here at the Wilson Center, was not of my own doing. I'm very proud to say that I am part of a service that has elected or has grown a female service secretary. That's the leader of the military service. We're the only service to achieve that, not just 1, but 3. We're the first service to grow a female combatant commander. That is General Lori Robinson, the only service to accomplish that. We've grown several female general officers, and we are leading the services in regards to the number of women serving. So it's it's an incredible honor to be a part of a service that has achieved such great accomplishments. But like I said, my rise to be a fellow at the Wilson Center was not of my own doing. She mentioned you can't beat if you don't see it. As a young captain, I first saw then Colonel Stacey Harris on a panel talking about women in service and the ability to be able to rise to that level. I was a captain, she was a colonel. Today, General Stacey Harris, she is our Inspector General. She is the first black female 3-star general in the Air Force, and she today runs the programs that ensure that we have fairness and equality and allows everybody to be a part of a culture where you can excel. And that's a pretty extraordinary accomplishment. But I was able to rise throughout the years because I could see somebody at that rank grow, first meeting her when I was a captain, and today I'm a colonel. But also, it wasn't just people like Stacey Harris. My previous boss was by the name of General David Goldfein, and he previously served on the Joint Staff. And at that time, he started a culture on the Joint Staff where he looked to ensure we had slates to pick for key positions that were diverse. I served as his executive officer, and he led a culture that drove to say that we have key positions in the military that lead to promotion. And we need to ensure that when we look at these positions and we look at people that we're considering for these opportunities, that they're diverse. And that's a culture that he and Secretary James, our previous Secretary of the Air Force, and now Secretary Wilson, have continued to ensure that those positions within the military that lead to greater opportunity and promotion, they are diverse. And it's a slate that is more than just male slates. They include all kinds of diversity on those slates to allow everybody the opportunity to work and rise. I would also just like to say that, if you look across, you can't beat if you don't see it. You look to things like today, the United States Marine Corps has an amazing recruiting video that demonstrates women in combat. And as we look across the world, you know, where we have women serving in combat, warrior women, other countries can see women in leadership positions in combat. And when you do things like the Marine Corps, who's put out this amazing video that shows a woman in combat, young people in America can see, I can achieve to that rank too. And while we've had women recruiting videos, I really think it's incredible that today we have a lot more videos that reach out across that military-civilian divide and encourage young women to say that you can achieve these things too, whether it's in combat, whether it's serving in positions of cyber, whether it's serving in intelligence positions. If you look at women in service today, traditionally most women serve in support career fields, but women can be fighter pilots. And it was people like I'd mentioned, General David Goldfein, who, you know, encouraged his young daughters. He's a fighter pilot in the military. He encouraged them to say, hey, women can be in flight suits too, and they can fly aircraft, and you can do it. And one of his daughters serves in the Air Force today. So really it's about, you know, not just the women who have been great examples of how people like me and other young officers can achieve success and grow to those levels, but it's also been incredible, courageous men who have, you know, kind of looked at some of their own maybe unconscious bias and stepped aside and encouraged policies and procedures that allow more diversity among the ranks and more inclusion at the table so that we can really change some of our practices and procedures to allow some of our best people to serve.
Thank you for sharing your experience, and kudos to the Air Force for being at the forefront among the services and putting women in leadership positions. Carla, Jen, did either of you want to respond to the first round of questions?
Two quick things. One, I would say, in response to the issue you raised about women warriors and how we deal with our own military, we should notice that our own National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security doesn't deal with domestic issues. And so we didn't look inward. And I think there's an important opportunity to do a complement or a supplement to that starts to bear down on a lot of these questions. With regard to the question from the ambassador about, you know, do women in these leadership roles, when you split leadership positions in international organizations or national governments, you see in Europe, Spain, Italy, elsewhere, having half of their cabinet? I think the answer is yes. It does make a big difference, and we talk about the value of having role models come ahead, and that is particularly important. You look at some of the research that's been done in India, for example, by Esther Duflo around women in government, and you do see that has an impact on expenditures, has an impact on modeling and girls' education, corruption, and other things. However, I would say that there are two buts that come after that. One is, I don't think you can conflate the leadership and representation with all of the economic and social progress that's embedded in the research that Valerie was talking about earlier. So it doesn't necessarily solve those issues. And you look in Rwanda, for example, and you see women's political representation, but the level of empowerment of the average woman in Rwanda has not risen commensurate with their political empowerment. And so that's really important to be aware of. And then the second is that in order for it to create a kind of virtuous cycle, you need the women in positions of power to help drive and change that agenda. And that takes critical mass, and that takes a willingness for them to advocate for that and feel the space to be able to make those changes. And I think Sherry's point was important in terms of her own career. Where do you perceive the space and the timing to align and enable you to really move the agenda forward when you get into positions of authority? And so I think that those two pieces, and they're not two small pieces, they're two large pieces, that's what enables parity in leadership roles to result in real transformation at a societal level.
And age structure is actually connected to this, even though it may not seem like it, since we've been talking about individual women and the numbers of children they have. But one of the things I didn't talk about in the 10 minutes was when you do complete the demographic transition, we're talking about very low fertility societies. So the book project that I'm working on right now during my sabbatical is looking at the countries that are surround the Pacific, Asia-Pacific countries, which tend to have very, very low fertility, but also a very high security threat environment, and what that aging has done to national defense. And one of the things that the U.S. military and all these other militaries are concerned about with their populations aging is military manpower shortages. And the same for labor force shortages. And so when in societies where that happens, one of the solutions that countries have put into place is recruiting more women. And so this means bringing more women into the workforce. It could be opening up roles for women within the military. And it's complicated and it takes a long time, but even with the age structure differerences, very low fertility societies can actually open up more opportunities for women so that you can see it and be it. An example of that would be in Japan. So the role of women culturally in society is connected to fertility. This is the hard part for policymakers. This is a hugely complex, you need a whiteboard for this. The reason a woman might choose not to have children is connected to different parts of the culture and society there and the way that young women feel. At the same time, Shinzo Abe has been trying to put some policies into place that will make it more compatible for women to have children and work. Some of them have worked, some of them have not. The ones that have not tend to come from a misunderstanding of what it is that women wanted in the first place, of what marriage can mean within Japan, for example. So it takes a lot to get these policies into place to bring women in, but once they do come in, then we can pick up the thread where you guys have talked about today. What is it like for a younger woman who sees these women in higher positions of power? So low fertility societies actually inherently have more opportunities for women, but how to bring women in is a very difficult policy choices.
I think that's a key point, Jen. The lowest fertility countries are those that have succeeded in bringing women into economic and educational parity, but at home they are still facing extremely patriarchal cultural expectations. Let's open it up to some other questions. There's a gentleman in the back. There's a lady over here.
Yeah, hi. My name is Miguel. I have a couple of examples and a question for Carla. I wanted to mention to add to your list Canada, where Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has a gender parity cabinet. You mentioned Spain and a few other countries in Europe. And then for Valerie, I was going to, well, Valerie, I was going to mention to you that I'll ask my question in general.
I'm a mother and I can multitask. Please speak.
I'll first ask my question for any people and anyone on the panel. In societies where the top position in those governments have been largely inherited based on familial ties, and South Asia is replete with such examples. I should ask my question, because the ambassador may be interested. You may also want to consider, Valerie, the Indian state of Kerala, which is a matriarchal society, and add that to possible thoughts about Mozambique, northern Mozambique, or Papua New Guinea, for example. I've heard this. I know nothing about it, but it's matriarchal. So another example, Kerala, ambassador. And then in southern India. And then the question is, so in these South Asian societies, and you have Indira Gandhi in India, Bandaranaike in Sri Lanka, Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, and in Bangladesh, both the leader of the government and the opposition are both women, Sheikh Hasina and Begum Khalida Zia. Do you find that their being in the top position has led, in fact, to any empowerment of women? Because, ironically, Indira Gandhi was such a powerful example, but she was called the only man in the cabinet. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what that says in terms of, of encouraging women, to rise and follow their example, when in fact they got the top position based on ties with, fathers, husbands, sons, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have two quick questions. One is about coercive family planning. So in, for example, China, how does coercive family planning affect or negate the positive changes you were talking about? And then my second question is about the conflict and subordination of women. How does external imposed conflict affect the subordination of women? Does it increase it, decrease it? Is this a pre-existing condition in some societies that doesn't come into being based on imposed conflict, or can it be created?
Thank you. And could you share your name?
Mary Swartz from State Department.
Thank you. So I think we're going to answer those two and then hopefully have time for one more quick round before the event concludes. So we have a question on sort of the South Asian example of women who rise up in leadership, but if I understand correctly, are still subject to very masculine expectations about their behavior. coercive family planning, and how does externally imposed conflict affect the subjugation of women?
Well, when I teach Women and Nations as a course at the Bush School, one of the things we do address is the great difference between the first generation of women leaders and the second generation of women leaders. Where the first generation of women leaders either are a stand-in for a man who is dead, and of course many of the people that you've identified are exactly that. And number two, have had to basically say, don't even look at me as a woman, consider me a man, right? But I think we're now well into the second generation of female leaders, where some of them actually, such as Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, said, vote for me because I am a woman, because the men destroyed this country and you want something different. And so I think there's a big shift then between that first and second generation, and with it, I think a difference in how women leaders behave that I think is important. And very interested in Kerala. So, but again, is it matriarchal in the sense that women have power within those 11 variables that we've spoken of, or is it simply matrilineal again, where we can't assume that? And I'd be very interested in looking at that. I don't want to hog all the time, but I really find your question fascinating. This was actually a question that sociologist Peggy Reeves-Sanday, S-A-N-D-A-Y, investigated, and you may be interested in some of her research because in a sense it's the other side of the coin from what my work has been, but I find her work fascinating, which is to say I can tell you, and now with the help of the Defense Department, I can tell you very particularly what will happen to your nation when you choose that left-hand side, right? Economic decline, higher corruption, a rentier economy, much greater involvement in conflict, much greater terrorism profile. I can now pin that down for you. But what Sanday did was address this question of when the society, a society that is more gender equal, faces an external threat, which way do they go? Do they reach back to that old male supremacist complex, if you will, thereby undoing their own society's promotion of gender equality? Or do they find a new way, right, of making gender equality a strength which could help them overcome that external threat? And so if I'm granted another decade or two of life, one of the things I'd like to do is to pick up that baton from Sanday and ask, which way do societies go? Or if there's some that go both ways, what are the scope conditions under which one is chosen as versus another? But we do know, right, that war is so devastating in its effects that societies can make pretty drastic choices to have, as we saw in the Arab uprising, to subordinate women as a result of this threat, or as we've seen in other societies that have had to rebuild themselves from scratch, greater opportunities for women, right, that had never existed before because the men are physically not there anymore.
I want to talk about the coercive family planning in just a second, but I did want to say that one of the things we haven't mentioned yet, we've talked a lot about gender, but not class. And I think that's something that needs to be brought into the conversation because we are women of privilege. And I think about, I'm a mother of two, as I mentioned, and it's the privilege that allowed the privilege of having two incomes, of living in a city that's relatively inexpensive and so on, that allows me to be able to continue to work and have those children. But it also puts in some ways a cap on the number of children I think I could have and continue to work. But when we talk about women in leadership roles, most of the time they are women of privilege, and there can often be a disconnect between what the average woman in society might want or need and what the elite women in society might want or need. So that's something we might want to discuss at some point. on coercive family planning. It's terrible. I don't advocate it. It can work for a little while, but it's unnecessary. And so here's some examples of that. The societies tend to revert. If you were to pull out the coercive family planning variable, women will have a number of children based on larger factors in society, culture, but primarily economic factors. So you could think about China. China hastened the demographic transition that would have happened anyway through coercion. And then once demographers figured this out a long time ago, if China pulled the one-child policy, we wouldn't really notice any difference. So then when they did open it up to be a two-child policy, again, not so much. It was a transition, the demographic transition that happened due to larger economic conditions in the society, not just from coercion. And it can work the other way as well. I think about Romania. Ceausescu comes in and puts a lot of really coercive policies in place to try to encourage fertility. It blows through the roof, and when those policies go away, it completely implodes back to where it would have been based on the larger factors in society. So again, to point to Iran as the anti-China example, China being the example of coercion that hastened the demographic transition, Iran being an example, not coercion, but investment in public health that also had a very rapid demographic transition, and it just wasn't necessary.
Is there one final, very brief, specific question from the audience? No? All right. Well, I think we can close there. Thank you so much for coming, and let's all thank our panelists.